Hey folks, this is Riker, with a video about Path of Exile's upcoming 3.15 expansion, Expedition, which releases this Friday, July 23rd. This update introduces the Expedition League mechanic, tons of new build options, and a difficulty revamp that should slow the pace of the game down and increase the challenge. We're also seeing Path of Exile Royale return better than ever. In this video, we'll dive into the details about all this, and we'll thank GGG for sponsoring this video. So let's start by talking about the League itself. In Expedition, we'll be teaming up with a group of foreign explorers that are trying to figure out what happened to their ancestors who ventured to Rayclast as colonists, but were never heard from again. So we'll be visiting different sites that the explorers believe their ancestors tried to settle in the past. And it's, you know, equal parts archaeology and grave robbing. Now, by the time we arrive at any given site, the explorers will have already marked the site for us with signs indicating where chests are buried, poles indicating where their ancestors are buried, who have become horrific undead monsters, and they will possibly have unearthed some artifacts as well. But how exactly will we be excavating these sites? Well, as they say, there are very few personal problems that cannot be solved through a suitable application of high explosives. So you're gonna get to place a chain of explosives across the expedition site, planning what each blast will unearth. Then once you push the plunger, any undead freed by the explosion rise from the ground, and then the fighting starts. You'll get to plan how to place the explosives strategically. There's risk versus reward. Do you go mostly for chests, or do you go for more monsters? Do you go for these special, more challenging monsters that give a higher reward, and so on. Another thing you can choose to detonate is called a remnant. These remnants have various modifiers on them, and if you choose to blow up a remnant, then those modifiers apply to anything that comes next in the detonation chain. So this will increase reward and difficulty, and there may be some modifiers that you'll really need to think about whether you want to take on. So the whole process, you get to a site, you look at your options of things to blow up, then you plan your detonation chain. Not just what you want to blow up, but in what order, then you boom. Then you fight, and you reap those sweet, sweet rewards. And let's talk about those sweet, sweet rewards. You'll be finding ruined artifacts that you can use to trade with 4 different new vendors. And the really interesting part is that each vendor has their own unique trading behavior and asks for a specific kind of ruined artifact as payment. This is one of my favorite parts about this expansion. So the first vendor you have is Toioiz. He lists his items at just a ridiculous price, but you can haggle with him. There's a mechanic that lets you offer a lower price than what he's asking for. He may then accept your offer, or he may then counteroffer, or he may become so offended by your lowballing that he just refuses to sell the item to you altogether. So if you see an item that you really want, you have to play the risk versus reward game. Do you just pay the crazy high price, or do you risk haggling? How much do you haggle? It's bringing in these elements of RPG mechanics, and I know a lot of ARPG players have been saying the genre is lacking a lot of these deeper RPG-ish mechanics lately. Then the second vendor you have is Rog. If you buy one of Rog's items, he'll then try to upsell you. That is, he'll offer to improve the item that you want to buy by crafting on it, for a higher price, of course. If you accept his upsell, he'll do it again, and again, and again, until you decide enough's enough. Then third, we have Gwenin. She's the gambler. She offers you a set of base item types with unknown properties. You gamble on an item, and then you find out if you bought a piece of junk, or if you won the jackpot with a great unique, or an item with amazing affixes. Then lastly, you have Judnich. He's the leader of the expedition, and he's basically the exchanger that facilitates trading with the other vendors. From him, you can trade a variety of useful things that help with the other vendors, like a currency that lets you re-roll a vendor's inventory. And don't worry, you'll have a special expedition locker to stash all your expedition currency. Now, another thing you're going to find is logbooks, which basically take you on super expeditions that are not just larger in size, but they also include special objects you can interact with using explosives. For example, you can blow open a passageway to reveal hidden chests or bosses. Oh, did I mention? New bosses to fight, of course. I mean, just look at this guy. Looks like he's gonna reap my soul. The logbook itself gives you a number of possible expeditions to choose from, each with different modifiers, and like a map, you can craft modifiers onto these logbooks to increase the challenge and reward. Lastly, on expeditions, you can find new uniques as well as new base item types. Instead of having armor, evasion, or energy shield, these new items have something called Ward. Ward absorbs a fixed amount of damage once every 5 seconds. It's a new type of defense, and enemies you encounter in Expedition will also have Ward as a defensive stat, and items can roll with affixes that buff or alter Ward. Now, outside of the Expedition mechanic, this update introduces a ton of new skills. 19 new skill and support gems. Now, typically in a PoE expansion, we see gems revolve around a theme or a specific playstyle, maybe a couple, but this time around, the devs decided to basically go in the complete opposite direction and just cover as many different playstyles as possible, so that no matter what your interests or preferred playstyle is, there's a new skill for you. We're talking about summon skills, melee, projectile, AoE, single target, spells, arrows, shield skills, war cries, you name it. My favorite though has gotta be Spectral Helix, that throws a spectral copy of your melee weapon, which spirals outwards from you and deals damage to enemies it passes through. Plus, the projectiles also bounce off walls and can continue to hit enemies. Alright, now another thing this expansion seeks to do is a massive balance overhaul of the game. Expedition is the 30th Path of Exile release, so that's 30 content updates that have added new items, crafting options, game systems, and as Chris explained in the reveal of this expansion, it would only take an 8% increase in player power per expansion to result in a 10 times increase in player power since the game released. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Endgame characters today in Path of Exile are about 10 times stronger than they were at launch. Now, the devs haven't been afraid to nerf things. They've consistently nerfed OP builds over the years, but the average power level has nonetheless gradually increased as more content and options were added to the game. And they've also added new, more challenging endgame content to keep players challenged as their player power has increased. But the rest of the game has become relatively easier over the years. I mean, I'd love to believe that I've just become a much better player, but I do think back on how much more I struggled with the content years ago. So the devs felt it was time to address the power creep.
Some games handle this by just endlessly and exponentially scaling monster life and damage to counteract player power growth. This is a really cheap approach and makes the game feel like a treadmill where the developers are just turning a knob as they hand you new power, keeping you in the same place forever.
I don't... So the design goal was not to just nerf specific builds, but to improve the game and its challenge, and ensure that the optimum strategies are actually enjoyable ways to play the game, which leads to them addressing Flask Piano. The term Flask Piano has been used in the community to describe the playstyle of just spamming your flask buttons to be constantly drinking your flasks in order to benefit from the different short-term buffs that they give, all while continuing to mow down monsters to keep those flasks replenished. So with this update, most utility and unique flasks have been rebalanced to discourage this behavior, or outright prevent it. But to compensate, the devs have introduced some ways to upgrade your flasks. First, with an instilling orb, you can make a flask automatically trigger upon a certain condition. For instance, if you receive a bleed effect, you can automatically drink a flask that removes the bleed effect. The second is the enkindling orb that prevents a flask from gaining charges while the flask effect is active, but it gives a big buff. This basically means that you have to be much more strategic about when you use the flask, but when you do use it, it's powerful. We're also seeing nerfs to some of the stronger movement skills so that players can't just completely bypass monster mechanics, and general nerfs to support gems to reduce the damage of an average build by about 20%, and the best builds by about 40%. They're also rebalancing the campaign to be more challenging, focusing this expansion on Act 1, but in the future they're going to extend that to subsequent expansions. I think it's going to take about a year to cover the entire campaign. Now lastly, we'll talk about PoE Royale. In 2018, GGG added a Battle Royale mode to Path of Exile as an April Fool's joke. But people loved it. It was only around for a weekend, but now it's back. They're going to turn it on every weekend throughout this league, starting the week after Expedition's launch. And they also had it running last weekend, I was finally able to play this after years of hoping it would return, and it honestly was the most fun I've ever had in PvP in an ARPG. Let's face it, the PvP scene in ARPGs these days is just about dead, so this is a nice shot in the arm to maybe making a scene happen. But not only is Path of Exile Royale back, it's also better. The original PoE Royale used the regular PoE skill tree, but now they've built a custom passive tree just for Royale. And they've created low-level versions of around 50 skill gems, 20 support gems, and over 70 unique items just for this game mode. They also reworked the island that the Battle Royale takes place on, they've built a better spectator mode, better leaderboards, a better ability to loot the bodies of dead players as opposed to them just dropping all their items on the ground. And if you get first place in Battle Royale, you actually do get a prize. It's a special cosmetic for your hideout, the Roa dinner decoration. And the more you win, the more impressive it becomes. And that's going to wrap up this video. As a reminder, Expedition launches this Friday, July 23rd, and you can click the link in the description for more details. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to join Riker's Raiders for more gaming content.